Well, welcome everyone. It's a great pleasure to have you join us for this evening's webinar, hosted by the Department of Social Work and the Social Work Alumni Association of the University of Melbourne. My name's Lou Harms and I'm the Chair and Head of the Department of Social Work, and it's my great pleasure to be your host for this evening. As we gather, I want to open this panel with acknowledgement of the traditional custodians of this land on which I am working this evening, and many of you others are also, I know, on Wurundjeri land. So I pay my respects to the elders past and present of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I also want to acknowledge our Indigenous colleagues here with us today, and also to acknowledge that wherever you are in the world experiencing this webinar, to acknowledge the Indigenous custodians of the land on which you are present. So welcome to this evening or this morning, wherever you are. Some housekeeping for this webinar ahead. All of you have been automatically muted and your video cameras are off. We do have the Q&A function open, and that will be monitored by staff behind the scenes. And if we have time this evening, we'd certainly like to pick up some of those questions or comments with you. But tonight is an important webinar event around our 80th anniversary celebrations of social work education at the University of Melbourne. We're very pleased to open this as both an alumni event, but also importantly as part of the International Conference on Practice Research that the department is concurrently hosting over these days ahead. So whether you're an alumni, whether you're a delegate of the conference, whether you're a friend of social work, we welcome you to this webinar discussion. So the way today will proceed. Firstly, we're going to have a webinar presentation by Dr. Jane Miller, and that's focusing in on the topic of 80 years of social work education at the University of Melbourne, emerging themes and reflections. In this webinar, Jane Miller will walk us through some of the key themes from her doctoral research, and as well as a book that she has just finished writing, that consider the foundations of social work education in Australia and the course at the University of Melbourne. And so she'll look thematically at some of the hallmarks of that education, and then she'll look critically at some of the areas that were not part of that early history, a critical reflexivity around Indigenous Australia and practice with Indigenous communities, a critical reflection around the absence of a focus on violence against women, and also looking at the ways in which such a female-dominated profession has been understood or not throughout that history. So after that presentation, we'll then move to a panel discussion reflecting various voices in social work education and practice some 80 years on from those foundations to pick up those threads. So I'll introduce our panellists later when we come to that point in the proceedings, but I now want to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Jane Miller, AM. I know many of you in our alumni know Jane well, but others of you will be very interested in her background and introduction here. Jane is a retired social work practitioner with over 40 years of experience in hospital social work and in senior policy and management roles in the Victorian Public Service. She's published articles on women's issues, disability rights, and social work expertise. Recently, she co-edited a book on the life of Dr. Len Tierney. She's also a life member of the Australian Association of Social Workers, our national body. She's a former president of the University of Melbourne Social Work Alumni Association, and she's just completed this book that I mentioned on our social work pioneers. So her doctoral research enabled her to do the kind of forensic work that is unique in Australia. It hasn't been done before, to look at what were the foundations of social work practice, policy, and importantly, education. So without further ado, we'll move now to hear from Dr. Jane Miller, and then we will move on to our panel discussion. So welcome. We hope you enjoy this discussion. Join the Q&A if issues crop up for you. Otherwise, listen and engage with these topics ahead.
Today I'm going to discuss a few of the enduring themes in social work at the University of Melbourne. Australian social work was founded by philanthropically minded people in Sydney and Melbourne. From 1929, social work was taught outside the university in both New South Wales and Victoria. Then in 1940, when the universities considered that they had reached a suitable standard, both courses were accepted into their local university. In those days, Melbourne and Sydney each had only one university. For the international audience, I need to explain that the commencement of Australian social work came 30 years later than in many other countries. In the early 1900s, social work education had sprung up in multiple sites in Britain and the USA. It had also been established in several places in Europe. Amsterdam is credited with starting the world's first full-time social work course in 1899. Countries as far away from here as China and Chile had established social work education well before we did. The themes I'm going to talk about are excellence, profession building, and advocacy. Over 80 years, Australia has changed and new arenas for social work have emerged. Two critically important themes that weren't thought of by our founders but have emerged in the last part of the 20th century are those of women and of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. So I'll also discuss their emergence. Like any 80-year-old, this course has had its highs and lows, but I'm confident in saying that it was the Melbourne course which laid the initial strong foundations for Australian social work today. This was mainly because the Sydney course, which had started strongly in 1929 at the same time as Melbourne's Alumni course, quickly ran into problems in getting agreement on what was the core work of social workers and what the students should be learning. This issue was bitterly debated and was only resolved when the University of Sydney took over the course in 1940, with Canadian social worker Elizabeth Govan in charge. So it was Melbourne that had to carry the work of course development in the first decade. Academic excellence, which would lead to professional expertise, was the first pillar of social work education. The Board of Social Studies in Melbourne, which oversaw social work education from 1933, went to great pains to select its first director, Jocelyn Hislop. They advertised in England, and Edith Eckard, the much-loved London School of Economics social work leader, advised them on selection. The BSS wanted excellence and had specifically rejected the approach that had been used in Sydney, where a local arts graduate, Aileen Fitzpatrick, was selected, training her on the job. Miss Hislop held 3 degrees from the LSE, including the radical new mental health certificate, which introduced psychiatric social work to the UK. She had strong clinical and lecturing experience. She'd worked in some of the toughest areas in England, doing family welfare work in the desperate London slums, and then was a pioneering psychiatric social worker with infants in the kindergarten of the Leeds Babies Welcome Society. Babies in northern England were dying from disease, starvation and neglect. The Babies Welcome Society had been established to try to combat the very high infant mortality rate. The BSS sent Hislop on a 3-month tour of the USA on her way to Australia so she could familiarise herself with the best practice in agencies and schools of social work there. The Americans were extremely impressed with her and she was with them. This is the only picture we have of Jocelyn Hislop, our founding head. Here she is taking her successor, Miss Hoban, through the research index cards which were used in the pre-computer era. They are telling the story of their course. It is highly professional and it's research-based. So excellence underpinned by research was a strong theme. In the early days, Hislop and the Board of Social Studies had to fight for standards. At one point, they had to rebut criticism from the Victorian Health Department that their standards were too high. Despite a desperate social work shortage, they relentlessly failed students who did not pass exams. They put difficult subjects on the syllabus. There was one subject they insisted on keeping called Modern Political Institutions. This covered in-depth analysis of democratic government in Europe and America, fascism in Italy and Germany, and the Soviet system, communism. In pre-World War II Australia, they believed this was essential knowledge for the young social worker. Of course, then no one knew what would be the outcome of the Second World War and of the struggles with communism and fascism in Europe. Despite the fact that their students failed this subject in droves, the board insisted on keeping it on the agenda. because standards were the be-all and end-all. As early as 1933, Hislop had recommended that social work should be a postgraduate course, as it was and still is in the USA. However, it was not until 1974 that Melbourne moved to the 4-year Bachelor of Social Work, and in 1975 offered the first Master's, which was by major thesis. In 1987, Linda Campbell, whose doctorate was supervised by Len Tierney, became the first person to graduate with a PhD supervised within the Melbourne School of Social Work. The establishment of postgraduate education was tremendously important for building a local body of knowledge, developing good researchers, and a core of Australians to teach social work. At last, we did not have to rely on overseas postgraduate education. Research was integral to the social work training from the start. In fact, recently, Jocelyn Hislop has been identified as one of Australia's early sociologists. She lectured in sociology, which she had studied at the LSE. Research under her direction included a range of diverse social surveys. In 1940, she led a group of social workers and students surveying and assessing the suitability of foster homes for projected wartime refugee children. They worked solidly for 3 weeks, including weekends, and visited 1,600 homes. Ruth Hoban, the second head of social work, was also interested in research, and in 1943 she conducted a groundbreaking survey of municipal services in South Melbourne. The council was so impressed that it created the first municipal social work position in Melbourne. The research was almost entirely social surveys at that time, not evaluation of outcomes of interventions or studies of methods of working, although Hislop had espoused the importance of that sort of research. No doubt she was influenced by the work of Mary Richmond. As it's part of its commitment to excellence in education, strong field teaching and strong links with the social work field have endured from the beginning. Following the American approach, Hislop insisted that 50% of student education should take place in the field to ensure that her graduates would be completely competent as social workers at the point of graduation. This was very burdensome, particularly as there were virtually no trained social workers in Victoria to act as supervisors. It meant that the number of students undertaking the course had to be restricted in spite of the pressure from state and federal government and from NGOs to train more social workers. As late as 1947, 25 students were admitted in first year, but a further 22 who they thought were suitable were rejected because of the fieldwork crisis. Sadly, they hadn't thought of practice labs, which weren't introduced until the 1970s. But the point is that the social work course always emphasised professional training, the how-to of doing social work, and it was never to be mere sociology, psychology and politics. I think this is an enduring theme in the Melbourne course. Today's 1,000 hours of field education is just as strong as the placement schedule of the 1960s, where the education took place in 3 term time placements, 2 6-week and 1 3-month placement in the long vacation. The emphasis on practice continues. Hand in hand with this was the custom from the start in the course of relying on experienced practitioners to do sessional teaching. This greatly enriches the student experience, bringing immediate relevant case material to the class. This is something which fortunately continues today. Some of the greats of Australian social work taught in the course sessionally: Lyra Taylor, Teresa Wardell, Beryl Thomas, to name a few. Len Tierney started out teaching the course sessionally while he was working at the Citizens Welfare Service. Today's students are tremendously fortunate to have a group of wonderful, experienced social workers doing sessional teaching and bringing their practice wisdom and their fresh knowledge of current issues into the classroom. Another enduring theme is unity of purpose. We are one generic profession which can travel between social work settings successfully. This was a clear original intention of the Melbourne course. Specialist medical training, social work training, actually started in 1929, as I said, but when in 1933 the forerunner of our Melbourne University course commenced, it was immediately agreed of both the Arminers, who were the medical social workers, and the founders of the generalist course, that it was essential to have one unified course. Alison Player, who was the head of the Arminer course, drove the amalgamation of the that Arminer course with the generalist course when it became a 3-year course in 1947. Alison Player was to become the second national president of the AASW, following on from Sydney's Norma Parker. I mention this emphasis as the lack of unity still bedevils Britain and has undermined their educational courses, as well as the profession's status and identity. In taking this unified approach, we chose to follow the USA. In 1935, Hislop identified 6 main areas of social work practice: child welfare, relief, family welfare, juvenile and adult delinquents, medical social work, and organisation for community needs. Social work has been very enterprising in entering new fields of practice, but not all of them have endured. The pictures coming up now give some flavour of the many faces of social work over the first 40 years. A famous social worker once described social work as a chameleon profession, saying that this was one of the reasons it would survive as a profession. The flexibility of our profession, its ability to go into new areas, bringing the core skills and values of social work, is a plus. But the fact that we span so many workplaces or sectors has its challenges. Social workers are found in so many places, ranging from the justice system to health and mental health, in NGOs, all 3 levels of government, and recently increasingly in private practice. Maintaining unity is an ongoing challenge. Our founders were not just setting up a course to teach social work, but pioneering a new profession. They established a Victorian Association of Social Workers, of which Miss Hislop was president, and were involved in the establishment of the National AASW in 1946. They communicated with their interstate colleagues in the courses in Sydney and Adelaide, and in fact it was staff from this university which established and for over a decade produced Forum, which later became the national journal Australian Social Work. I believe that profession building is just as important today as it was 80 years ago. We can't afford to be complacent, and we need our national association to advocate for the profession. The last of the original themes I want to mention is advocacy and commitment to social justice. Jocelyn Hislop saw the systemic injustices in society and was a strong advocate for the underdog. The issues in the 1930s, when we were in the grip of the Great Depression, were different from today. These pictures, taken by slum reformer Os Barnett, show how grim it was for the poor during the Depression. It wasn't until after World War II that the federal government began to provide the level of pensions and benefits which we expect today. Landlords ruthlessly evicted families onto the streets, and their children often ended up in children's homes just because the family was homeless. People, particularly children, starved. I will give just a couple of examples of Jocelyn Hislop's advocacy. The Child Gardens movement was developing at this time. The main idea behind this was that children should not be treated as criminals, but as victims of society who should be helped. In 1936, when she talked to the Legal Women's Association, Hislop advocated for a single court for children, which was supported by treatment facilities to help the child rather than punish him or her. Australia today needs reminding that children who fall foul of the law are more often in need of help than punishment. The way in which Aboriginal children in particular are incarcerated is a national disgrace. In 1937, Hislop gave a speech at Women's College, which was later published as A Philosophy of Social Progress. She argued that the unemployed were victims of the economic system, not their own so-called lack of fibre. If they were victims of society and unemployment was not their own fault, shouldn't they be accorded the same consideration as the returned soldier? She saw what was later called a person in environment. She challenged her audience. Have we the right to condemn the sustenance road workers for idleness while we forget the months of underfeeding, the blistered hands and the lack of incentive in a rationed task. It's the right of everyone to expect such consideration, and it is the duty of all to attempt to give it. Such reciprocity will give us social justice, the only possible condition for social progress. What did the students take from this sort of leadership? The early social work students were imbued with a spirit of inquiry and a willingness to understand, not to blame. In 1972, looking back, Alison Player recalled that she and a fellow social work friend wondered if they could actually survive on sustenance, which was 9 shillings a week, approximately 10 cents. Instead of 9p on a loaf of bread, they borrowed the flat of a friend for a week, and she remembered we were very dear friends and nearly came to blows before we finished, because one of us might spend 10p, i.e. 10 cents, instead of 9p on a loaf of bread. I can remember going off to the public library and taking our lunch, which was a bag of broken biscuits and cheese ends. We decided that no one really could live on sustenance. Nobody ever thought that people could live on 9 shillings a week. However, we thought that we should just test it. I shall now talk about some of the things the early social workers did not do, which emerged later. Looking back over 80 years, it's easy to be hypercritical of past practices, and I've not been the only older social worker who's been disturbed by the ill-informed debate about the past. Social work is socially and culturally based. Yes, social workers often work on the advanced edges of social reform and even act as whistleblowers, as their work often shows them patterns of problems or of discrimination. They may be involved in politics or social movements outside their work, but they're embedded in their society and also have the constraints and royalties involved in being employees of agencies or government departments. Much has changed in our society over the past 80 years. I'm just going to talk about 2 themes which were not leading themes in early social work, and today people wonder how on earth they weren't. These were women and people of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent. First of all, women as clients. I don't think any social worker forgets their first clients. At the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, which was a cutting-edge agency where I had my first job, I won't forget the particularly pretty young mother of 3 who came in one day with 2 black eyes and one of her front teeth missing. Will I shock you if I say, as far as I recall, I did nothing? Then social workers, just like their clients, were trapped. Women's refuges were not to start for at least another decade as a result of the women's movement. There was virtually no childcare, and there was effectively no social security for women who left their husbands. They had to prove something called constructive desertion. Police regarded family violence as just a domestic. Supporting parents' benefits were first introduced by the Whitlam government in the 70s. What could a 23-year-old new graduate do realistically? It's likely any action I had taken would have made things worse for this woman. What has been termed forced adoption is another case in point. Social workers have been lumped in with the many and diverse baby removers. I do not doubt that there would have been some who were insensitive to the young mothers. Yet many did try to help mothers keep their babies. We need to remember that in the 1950s, the pill had not been invented, and when it did become available, many doctors refused to supply it to unmarried women. Abortion was illegal and very expensive. There was virtually no childcare, and there were no pensions for supporting parents, or as they were then called, single mothers. Forced sexual relations weren't necessarily regarded as rape in the way they would be today. There was a general view in society that nurture, not nature, was more important in a child's life, so adoption was a kind thing to do for the baby. The stigma against bastards and unmarried mothers, who automatically brought deep shame on their family, is impossible to imagine today. The father of the child, on the other hand, might be regarded as sowing his wild oats, nothing to be too worried about. Realistically, a teenage mother had almost no hope of bringing up her baby unless her family supported her. Yet social work colleagues remember having the phone slammed down in their ear by angry parents who wanted nothing to do with their errant daughter. The full story here has not yet been told. We need more research on this area by social workers such as that of Jenny Conrick, who the university is fortunate to have as a sessional teacher. But we should also remember that social workers were also advocates for change, and we can be very proud that one of our alumni, Eric Benjamin, was behind the scenes in the founding of the Council for the Single Mother and her child. Behind the scenes is often where you'll find social workers on the cutting edge of change. Now I want to turn to the implications of being a women's profession. Social work started in Australia between the first and second wave women's movements. It's a little shocking to read articles by Jocelyn Hislop, the embodiment of an intelligent, highly educated female leader, where she uses only one personal pronoun, the masculine, he, him, when talking of her profession. It was almost as if the suffragettes had never existed. Women had gained entry to universities, but not to most of the professions. In the early 20th century, women could graduate as doctors, but their careers would then be actively thwarted by men with such claims that they could not work in certain hospitals because of the lack of female toilets. They also suffered from the restrictions of the employment of married women. In the 1950s, Alison Player had to give up her position as the deputy head of Tarana, the state government's children's home, when she married fellow social worker Hamish Matthew. Dr. Georgina Sweet, who was a distinguished zoologist and the first woman to gain a doctorate from an Australian university, was the person who initiated the social work course. She was overlooked for a professorship, which many colleagues felt she deserved. An Englishman with lesser qualification was appointed. Even in my time, a friend who was among a handful of women who did law in the early 60s remembers the intimidating experience of coming into lecture theatres where the men booed and hissed them. They used to wait outside until there was a small group of them so that they could go in together. When I started out as a social worker, even in this female profession, women were paid less than men under the award. Needless to say, married women were not allowed to join the superannuation schemes and could not be permanent public servants. In the 60s, there was an active bias to recruiting men to the profession, as it was thought they would be stronger at building the profession. There was no active discussion of flexible working arrangements for women with family responsibilities until the 70s. As I mentioned, there was no childcare system of the kind we have today, and wealthy women might have nannies, but the rest had to find a less than adequate private arrangement or stay home to raise their children. But this little women's profession allowed clever women to have really wonderful careers. I'll just talk about 3 outstanding women who deserve to have biographies written on them. Over a 30-year period, Joan Tuxson led reform in the care of children with disabilities from an era when they were locked up in back rooms to hide the family's disgrace, to being treated with respect and given opportunities to work, be educated and to socialise. That was at the Victorian Society for Crippled Children. Alison Player helped to build the profession in Australia and worked in leadership roles in health and welfare. She was the second national president of the AASW. Lyra Taylor spearheaded social work in the Department of Social Security from 1944 and was an inspirational leader to her staff who were deployed all around Australia. She used to go as far as Perth and Brisbane to personally supervise her staff. She was a vice president of First Board of the National AASW. Yet, when she'd been at her post for a couple of weeks, the head clerk asked her when she'd be joining the women's roster for the tea trolley. Of course, she refused. Since the women's movement of the 70s and the Whitlam government's reforms, women have had far better job opportunities in social work in Australia. Do we yet have the social worker work-life balance right? In our society, women still take more than their fair share of home responsibilities. I can only say that I know many social workers who will following becoming parents, have achieved far less in their careers than their early promise might have suggested they would. Are women deliberately underachieving, or are they making responsible decisions to prioritise raising their families? We talk about rights and corresponding responsibilities. Do they have a responsibility to make their best contribution alongside the right to opt out of the workforce? Now, one of the inspiring things that has happened in Australia in the last 20 years has been the increasing strength of the Indigenous voice. Having Indigenous parliamentarians, seeing many Indigenous people in professional roles as doctors, nurses, social workers, and so on, as well as on TV, cinema, and the stage, including music of all kinds, even opera. Aboriginal art has really helped many Australians to understand aspects of Aboriginal culture, including the importance of country. In earlier times, as artist and author Sally Morgan pointed out so poignantly in her autobiography, My Place, Indigenous people had good reason for denying their identity. They risked having their children taken from them. People will remember that Sally's family successfully pretended that they were Indian, not Aboriginal. Social work here at the University of Melbourne has been one of the important innovators, but we have such a long way to go. At least we now have a much better way of knowing what needs to be done and have developed respectful ways for non-Aboriginal people to work with Aboriginal colleagues. Some of my most enjoyable work was when I worked at the Royal Children's Hospital with Angela Clark, Neville Austin, and the University's Shawana Andrews, who we were lucky to have as a student. Our challenge was to develop a strong and safe way of welcoming Aboriginal kids and their families in the hospital and giving them a sense of being surrounded by their own community, not by potentially hostile strangers. It was a huge learning curve for me, but luckily I had generous teachers. Most of you will know that Shawana is now playing an important role on staff here. Social work in Australian society in general needed to go through a long learning process. What needs to happen has been wonderfully described in a recent article, The Getting of Wisdom by Simon Gardner. Reflecting back on his career, he talks frankly about how his lack of understanding of the communal nature of Aboriginal society undermined his ability to help an Aboriginal mother keep her children with her. He moved mountains getting her children reunited with her and finding her good accommodation. But the fact that he hadn't understood the enduring hurt experienced by her as part of the stolen generation, or just how important family and culture were for her mental health, meant that in the end she did not manage to parent her children. Some comfort can be taken from the fact that Simon's work meant that these kids actually knew each other and lived together. We need more honest, reflective writing of this nature. But looking back at the lack of curriculum on Aboriginal issues, one could imagine that social workers weren't interested. Yet Faye Miles, who's one of our alumni, and incidentally one of Lyra Taylor's girls, as they were called, and became the first female chancellor of this university, recalled in her autobiography, Aiming for the Skies, that she was completely inspired by lectures on Aboriginal life from Caroline Kelly, an anthropologist, in 1944. This helped her understanding of Indigenous clients, whom she encountered in her first job, working in Brisbane for Social Security. Decades later, in the 70s, as the Victorian Commissioner for Equal Opportunity, she employed Aboriginal staff and had a chance to make a difference for Indigenous Victorians as she implemented legislation that made discrimination on the grounds of race unlawful. By the time I was at the university in the early 60s, the Australian Union of Students had started something called Absco, Aboriginal Scholarships, in response to concern that no Aboriginal person had ever graduated from university. In hindsight, although this was well-intentioned, the recipients didn't get the sort of cultural support they would have needed to be able to be pioneers. We know now that it's not culturally safe to have just one Aboriginal person pioneering new roles alone, and that widespread organisation was essential. The cultural struggle just wasn't understood, but some of our students were very active here. Phil Boas, Tanya Harris, and Colin Benjamin, to name 3 alumni, were very active in Absco. When I finally had the pleasure of working with Aboriginal people in a hospital, I drew on my experience in reading about effective ways of embedding minorities in workplaces, a lot from the disability literature, and then learnt from my Indigenous colleagues about the culturally appropriate ways of going about things. This cultural information just was not available in 1934 or even 1954, well, not to non-Aboriginal people. social work with Aboriginal people and the development of a cadre of Aboriginal social workers couldn't happen in a knowledge vacuum. Melbourne University Social Work is justifiably proud of its excellent course. It's graduated many social workers who've made significant contributions to Australian society and overseas as well. There's continuity from its beginnings in the university in 1940. It's been a place where issues about a just society can be debated. The current cohort of students, who tend to be a decade older than the school leavers Ms. Hislop had to educate, bring maturity and additional skills to their studies. Research is more sophisticated. It's so encouraging, though, to know that the Melbourne course has a rich research agenda, and that just as they were 80 years ago, staff are still partnering with social work agencies to do research, more formally these days. This interplay between university and practitioner has been something that happened from day one and continues to be an essential element of the course. Jocelyn Hislop's main concerns were the dreadful poverty of the day and the shocking neglect of young children. Today, in a quite different world, there are other pressing social issues. Under Louise Harms' firm leadership, women and Indigenous people are high priorities. But just as in Jocelyn Hislop's time, Lou Harms and the staff stand for high standards. Most importantly, the social work department continues to do a great job of what Ms. Hislop called teaching for a profession, so it can continue to produce excellent social workers.
Well, Jane Miller, I know you're with us now on the screen, so I wonder if you are able to turn your camera on just for some brief words of thank you to you at this point. While you're doing that, I want to, there we are, Jane, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your scholarship with us in that extraordinary presentation. The ways in which you're a pioneer yourself, I think, for advocating practice research right throughout your career, the deep immersion that you've had in these last 10 years or so into those origins of our own education and profession have all come together beautifully in this presentation, which I know you could have spoken for many more hours on. So thank you for distilling the essential themes around that. And I think for such an evocative and provocative discussion there that you've presented to us. So to that end, I'm going to ask all of our panelists to turn their cameras on just so we can meet all of you, and I'll do some introductions. We're going to take up that provocation, I think, that you've left us with, Jane, to think about our past, our present and our future as a Department of Social Work, as practitioners who are graduates of the department, to say where to next. So I'll just introduce each of our panellists briefly, and then we'll move to each of them to present their response to your provocation. So Lee Vandewaker graduated from our course in 2018, and he completed his final placement with Territory Families, the Child Protection Agency in the Northern Territory of Australia. He's since been employed in child welfare services across the remote Aboriginal communities of West Arnhem Land, and is currently the team leader of remote services for Kakadu and Gunbalanya. So he's based in Northern Territory, and his previous experience includes 5 years of working in homelessness services back when he was in Melbourne. Then next we're going to hear from Joan Fang, who's based in Singapore. Joan has worked in the social welfare field in Singapore for the past 7 years. She recently graduated from our Master of Social Work course in 2020. She's also since then been employed in aged care services, focusing on providing care and rehabilitation for those elderly people living with mental illness. She's currently a senior social worker at her organisation, so that leadership theme coming through. And Joan's prior experience includes working within the criminal justice, family violence and hospital social work settings. Our third panellist is Emily Clark, who's joining us from lockdown in Melbourne. And Emily is also a recent graduate from the Master of Social Work degree, and she's previously worked in the community disability sector and has experience in community aged care through her placement at Bolton Clark during her Master of Social Work training. She's currently employed at St Vincent's Health and works in geriatric evaluation and management as a clinical social worker. Our fourth speaker is Auntie Lorraine Parsons. Auntie is an Aboriginal woman who identifies with her mother's Aliwa country and brings together her Aboriginal identity and her extensive experience as a social worker. Lorraine's worked in clinical social work, management and executive roles in acute and community health and in Aboriginal health. Lorraine is currently a sessional academic and leader in our department at the University of Melbourne and has been coordinating our subject social work practice, Indigenous peoples. And our final panellist for this evening is Associate Professor David Rose. David is the Director of Teaching and Learning for our Department of Social Work and also for the broader School of Health Sciences in which we now live. He teaches in the areas of legal and ethical contexts of practice and also program design and evaluation. He also currently serves as the Secretary and Board Member of the Asian Pacific Association for Social Work Education. So you can hear, I think, through all of those introductions, why we thought these panellists tonight would be key to respond to Jane's provocation of here we have our origins in social work in the 1940s. If we fast forward to 2021, how are we looking in regards to our practice preparation, our research preparation, and all of the advocacy work that Jane has touched on. So Lee, I'm going to pass over to you. Others present on screen with us all, but Lee, if you want to keep your camera on in particular, certainly ask for your response to Jane's presentation and the provocation she's given us tonight.
Thanks, Lou, and thank you to the University of Melbourne for asking me to be part of the panel this evening. Reflecting on Jane Miller's address, I think I'd just like to offer a comment on my own experience from the past few years working in the Northern Territory with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families. It's because while I agree that a lot of advances have been made in, how we partner with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families and work with them in respectful ways, one thing that I've really struggled with and questioned a lot in my own specific work context of child protection in remote communities is that as a non-Indigenous Australian, I'm not sure if it is possible for me to really attain culturally safe or ethical practice. And I guess the reason why I feel that is that, the presence of non-Indigenous child protection workers in the remote communities is a real source, is still a real source of fear and stress for a lot of families. And I guess the ability or the way in which families can respond and engage with workers differs dramatically depending on whether or not there's an Aboriginal worker present to help them, help support the worker and the family to, engage in the process and explain what's happening. And I think further on that, in the remote communities, it would appear that families, it appear that families feel the way in which families feel supported and can engage meaningfully falls in line with how closely related the Aboriginal workers are to them, as the ability to speak a local language and understand how the local kinship and systems and family structures go together is is critical to meaningful engagement and creating realistic and sustainable safety plans for children that might be at risk. And while I do have some incredible Aboriginal colleagues that provide me and the families we work with a lot of support, there's certainly not enough Aboriginal staff up here, which means that often in non-Indigenous staff don't have Aboriginal workers to partner with in their work. So, you know, I think to really improve the way in which social workers engage with and support First Nations families, there needs to be a lot of, I guess, creative, you know, creative ways of growing the number of Indigenous social workers that are training and studying. And I think up here, the NAJA, the Northern Australian Aboriginal Justice Agency, has had a lot of success in recent time in partnering with Charles Darwin University and training and graduating a lot of new lawyers and new Aboriginal lawyers. So I think, and they have plans to expand that work to other professions, which I think this year will include social work as well. So it'll be, I think it'll be really interesting to see how that partnership goes and if they can actually, you know, encourage a lot more Aboriginal people up here to enroll in social work courses and complete their training.
Thanks, Lee. I mean, I think that's an enormous challenge there that you've put out for the social work profession to strengthen its Indigenous base and its Indigenous ways of working there. Can I come back to you on your preparation for that practice and studying a Master of Social Work degree in Melbourne? Are there things, obviously there were, are there things that you could see we could do differently from the outset in preparing graduates?
I'm not sure, because I think, you know, thinking about this question, I don't know if it's really fair or realistic to expect a course taught in Melbourne to prepare someone for working in such a vastly different context that is the Northern Territory. And even, you know, in my final placement, even though it was in Darwin and working, you know, predominantly with Aboriginal families, the bridge between working in an urban context and remote context is still, you know, quite significant, even in, you know, a place like Darwin, which has a lot more, you know, a much greater Aboriginal population. So I'm not, you know, it's a difficult question to answer because I think, you know, Australia-wide, there is a significant knowledge gap around the, you know, lived experiences of Aboriginal people in remote communities. And, you know, and that includes a lot of missed opportunity to celebrate, you know, the incredible cultural diversity and, you know, stories of survival and resilience that are happening every day. And also there's not the discussion around the significant barriers that people face in their day-to-day lives and the challenges. So I'm not really sure, apart from, I guess, you know, the ways in which my studies prepared me for the work I'm doing now is definitely the final placement, but also the ongoing support that I've got from the faculty, that I know that there's people that I can turn to if I do have challenges in my work. And in particular, Jeanette Farrer has been an ongoing support and always someone I can turn to if I, you know, have questions or, you know, or doubts. And she's always forthcoming with any article or piece of research that she thinks might be helpful or useful to me. But I think, you know, in terms of preparing students from Melbourne to be better equipped for working with Aboriginal people, I think it's just sharing a lot of those stories about, you know, the successes and the really good stories that are happening and that are coming out of places like the Northern Territory that often don't really find their way down south. Because I mean, I certainly didn't have much insight into what was happening up here before I actually came up and experienced it for myself. So, yeah.
Thanks, Lee, and I think we'll come back to many of those issues, but I think you've highlighted, you know, some of the ways in which that partnership and lifelong learning then can be part of scaffolding that work, no matter the context. And we often very quickly debate how do we prepare graduates for work in so many different contexts. And so I really appreciate your insights on that. And speaking of that, Joan, I guess to go to you in Singapore and to reflect on your experience and hearing Jane's experience. I think I may have had just a little Zoom wobble there, but to how that's occurred for you in translating your knowledge from Melbourne back into social work contexts in Singapore.
I think that it has been great. So for me, my reflection on Jane's presentation is that I really enjoyed it very much, and I share her belief that profession building is just as important it is today as it was 80 years ago, with research being integral to the social work training. So for myself, together with the other social workers of this age, I feel very privileged because those who have come before us were committed to excellence in education and also field teaching. So this presentation has enabled me to appreciate how social work as a profession has grown from strength to strength. And in terms of your question where you were asking about how social work education has prepared me for practice, I think my social work education at UniMelb has prepared me for practice in several ways. I'll elaborate on one of these areas today. So I think I'll elaborate on research. So social work research and practice research is an area that I'm extremely passionate about. And I believe very strongly in evidence-based practice, which is a combination of clients' values, expertise and circumstances, our own professional expertise, as well as the best research evidence that is available. So my social work education included what was taught in the classroom and beyond. We were provided with opportunities to conduct scoping reviews, practice research, and present our research posters as part of the master's program. The social work educators at University of Melbourne, which includes the university social work professors, as well as the field supervisors, are by and large supportive. So through my time at UniMelb, I not only observed that our educators care deeply about the development of social work students, but I was also able to personally experience the care and commitment they have. So when my professors found out about my interest towards research, they actually provided me with platforms and opportunities to hone and advance my skills. I was able to lead research projects as a social work researcher at St. Vincent's Hospital, and I was also later given the opportunity to present my paper at the National ASW conference. So my educators also involved me in things like research conferences, planning for national and international social work conferences, and also writing research papers. So if you were to ask me what I've taken away from the master's program, I'll say that it is the care and commitment that I've experienced, and it is also this same care and commitment that I will bring along in my social work practice. So I recently commenced a new role in aged care services, which you have shared earlier, and I look forward to applying the many elements of what I have garnered through my social work education into practice.
Thank you so much, Joan, and for really emphasising that research piece. And I know you've been so integral in helping organise the International Practice Research Conference. So certainly some of our guests here tonight will be listening with interest to your reflections on that place of research in your training and preparation. So Emily, you've similarly just launched into social work career and the like, and I'd love to hear from you about the issues that have stayed with you from Jane's presentation.
I think, yes, thank you, Lou. I think one of the key things that really stuck with me from Jane's presentation was the real change we've seen, I think, in the discourse, both in our social work kind of education and degree, but also across the profession generally. Particularly, as Lee mentioned, that focus on how cultural responsiveness towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples has really been it wasn't a key tenet of the original social work course or the original or social work in general in the beginning. But now I think in our degree in particular, there's a really strong focus on that, on trying to kind of grow the new generation of social workers to be more culturally responsive, particularly towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So I think that really stuck with me because it really emphasised that our degree, as much as we try to be socially and culturally reflective, we still are a reflection of our culture that we're currently in, and there may always be things that we'll miss. And so I think personally it made me want to really refocus on being critically reflective in my work, particularly being a new social worker, really make sure that I'm not reflecting my own social-cultural position and related biases. So I think that was really my initial takeaway from that presentation.
Yes, and the challenge of doing that every day in the context of, say, a busy hospital context that you're working in and working with older people and in many ways in this last year responding to COVID no doubt, in that context. Were there elements that you thought we could better prepare you in that space for, I guess, the fields of practice that you've gone into, so disability and health?
I think the degree did teach me a lot of really good skills. For example, there is a lot of focus in the degree on critical reflection. I think in the tutorials, for example, tutors will constantly be asking students about how they felt about certain pieces in the lectures, and there are whole assignments focused on that critical reflection. And I do think, as I said, that skill is really key, especially when you're just starting out in practice. Particularly in a busy setting like the hospital, where I find you really kind of hit the ground running. So I think that was really useful in the degree. I think the practical element of the placements and things was very useful for me as well. Going in, I had a bit of personal experience, but I didn't have the workplace experience that some people have going into social work. Perhaps I think for me personally, some more focus on our placements are already quite huge, I know, but I think that kind of aspect of the degree would be helpful. And I think, yes, focusing more on practical skills like counselling and things, it probably would have helped me going into the field. But there is a lot of that already in the degree as well.
And it's been the perennial question, I think, of how to structure those experiences, and all the more so in this online world that we find ourselves in. How do we best prepare for that practice step from graduation into those early years of practice? So thank you, Emily. So turning to Auntie, there's been a couple of provocations here from Lee and from certainly Jane's paper as one of our leading Indigenous educators and senior practice and policy person over many years. Love to hear your thoughts.
Oh, thank you so much, Lou, and thank you for your lovely acknowledgement too. And Jane, what a rich history. And it really brought to my mind one word that wasn't mentioned back in the early days is intersectionality. And because I was really thinking about a bit of my history, and you really took me down memory lane, being there in the 60s when women were paid 75% of the male wage, and I was working in the public service and got married in the 60s and had to I left the public service and and so many things that you spoke about. When you spoke about My Place by Sally Morgan, that's my story too. That's the story of my family, and it brought back issues of identity for me. And identity is something that we stress very much in the Indigenous peoples subject, and have a whole lecture on that. But thinking back to the early days where Aboriginal affairs just weren't on the radar of social work, and come such a long way since then, and especially the acknowledgement of social work's participation in racist policy and practices, especially the removal of children and the apology from the AASW. And now we've come from there to we've got our students undertaking placements in Aboriginal organisations. And we tell them they're to go there with cultural humility and be humble learners and learn from Aboriginal people. Well, that certainly wouldn't have been thought of back in the early days of social work. There's no way they would have been thought you'd be learning from Aboriginal people. And I think something that Lee said in response to Jane too is about needing Aboriginal people to pave the way, when you're working with your Aboriginal clients. And that's the same thing in Melbourne too. We need that too. And we've got to grow our own. We need more Aboriginal students. And I've got a few ideas that I want to discuss with you later on, Lou, too, about that too. But we do, in the department here, we do rely on our Aboriginal staff to pave the way and to make those connections with Aboriginal organisations. Certainly in our Indigenous peoples subject, we use Aboriginal organisations, Aboriginal contacts to give our lectures, and because it's about engagement. And our students need to be able to connect with Aboriginal people, to connect with Aboriginal ideas, connect with Aboriginal ways of knowing, being, seeing, doing, all those sort of things, and bring the skills that they already have to that engagement. And some of the things that in the Indigenous peoples subject, some of the students have come to me in tears, grieving that they didn't know this. They didn't know about our history. They didn't know about the strength of Aboriginal people today. And I think that's going to change because I see kids in school now, they're learning a lot more. And I'm hoping in the next couple of years, you know, when we teach the Indigenous people's subject, we're going to have students who are a lot more informed than they previously were. And one of my co-board members on a board that I'm on, he was telling me about how his 3-year-old daughter in childcare, they do an acknowledgement every day. And the words of it were just beautiful. It was, what is it? Here is the ground, here is the sky, here are my friends, and here am I. And the busy bees, and that was the name of the room they were in childcare, the busy bees acknowledge the traditional owners of this land. And I thought, my God, for those children are growing up with that, surely our job's going to be a lot less in teaching our social work students if we've got children coming up learning that. I hope so. But it is so much about relationships and collaboration. And I think we can't separate the research part, the teaching part, and the social work placement part. We need to have Aboriginal issues embedded all through it. I think I'm really encouraged, Lou, by your leadership and the leadership of, you know, the leaders in the department, where Indigenous perspectives are woven throughout the curriculum, not just in the Indigenous people's subject. It's not just a subject that stands on its own. And also the Indigenous-led research, the Indigenous focus in placements, and but it does rely on Aboriginal staff to do that. So we need more. We've got to get more Aboriginal staff, and that comes with attracting social work students, offering them pathways through to research or to teaching, and really grow our staff. I could go on forever because I'm just so passionate about this, but is there anything else that I should talk about, Lou, that you'd like to see?
Look, I think you have set so much up there, Auntie, and I think if we hear perhaps then David's comment and come back to pick up those threads, because I think you've just touched on so beautifully that sort of generational change and how we look forward with that. I'd particularly like to come back to that issue, but if we rest just there, and then David, to give you the challenge then of saying, well, you're an architect of our curriculum, working with Auntie, other colleagues across the department, the School of Health Sciences. What do you take from Jane's presentation as the provocation?
Yes, great. Thank you, Lou. And thank you to Jane. I think I always love hearing Jane talk about her PhD research and just hearing some of the stories of some of those early people in social work. I mean, that's one thing I take from it, just some of the amazing things they did, both in setting up a social work course and developing those early parts of the social work course, but in many cases, also absolutely setting up the foundations of our social work in Australia in the professional sense as well. The other thing I take from it is, as an overall thing, is very much many things have changed and many things haven't changed. And so there's a lovely part, I think, in your presentation, Jane, talking about field education and difficulties with finding placement supervisors and that limiting the number of people that can go into a course. That sounds like a conversation we were probably having in the last few weeks, in fact, in our current context, particularly with COVID impacting on placements, etc., and the amazing job our field education education team have been doing around getting a very lot of different types of placements in this current context. And so some of those things continuing on very much through. I guess some of the key sorts of, trends and issues from my perspective, I would take from Jane's presentation and picking up, I think, from what Emily was saying. We know our students very much want a very practical and practice focus to the course. And obviously field education is one of the really key ways we do that. And so I guess in the current issues around field education are very much around what does that look like? How many hours do students go on field education? What's the capacity of the service system to actually provide those placements? And I guess what we're really saying, even in just in this last 12 months, both obviously within our university, other universities in Australia, and in fact internationally, is new ways that placements are being provided. And certainly we've got lots of interesting ways that's happening at the moment with our students having all just gone out on placement. And so combine ones with our department, research focused placements, lots of different ways that's actually happening. What we also know from that though is our student profile has probably shares some of the things, in fact, from the time you were looking at, Jane, but also different. But we know, for example, things like students need to be able to take on work and family responsibilities and all those things, and how does that in fact mix with full-time placements and those sorts of things. So lots of challenges to in fact keep that really strong practice component, which I think we all think is very important, but how does that mix with things today? I think, as you've mentioned in your presentation, we also bring a lot of experience from the field into our course through sessional teachers, and that's a really important way we do that. And of course, on the horizon is also just generally in social work, thinking about new ways that in fact, say, social work courses might be embedded with employment, and so that in fact placements will be taken over with those sorts of ways, some of the models we see in other countries happening. I think research is a really key theme coming from all of that. And just to say that has continued from those very beginnings Jane spoke about. We now obviously have pathways for people from social work courses to be able to go straight into PhD and sort of take that really formal research path. But in some ways, it's almost the counter position to the practice focus. For some students in the course, they see, in fact, we want the really strong practice area. And so the real challenge is, in fact, combining those two in the course. And obviously, with our panel tonight linked to the Practice Research Conference, really looking at developments in that area and how we can, in fact, say that research is so important in practice. I think professional building, a really key one, mentioned there, and it really strikes me as you spoke in the introduction there, Jane, around, you know, in many respects, the course here at Melbourne Uni, and I know we debate it to some extent, the Sydney course as well, very much not only setting up their courses, but in fact shaping the whole of the social work profession in Australia and how it developed. And I think, you know, that's that really enduring question, really, to what extent does social work education shape the profession, and to what extent does the profession in fact shape and influence social work education? And in fact, that's been a long-term debate, and I think it continues, and I suspect we would say it's a mix of both. But what that does mean for social work education now is lots of, I guess, pressures on what should be in the course. I think the discussions tonight, absolutely, we've seen those really positive things of a much greater focus on Indigenous peoples and on women. And from what you were describing, Jane, as your experience of working with a person who had experienced family violence, we have a much stronger focus on family violence, for example, within our courses now. I think you also highlighted poverty and social economic issues. I suspect many of us would say we've dropped a lot of those issues, in fact, from the agenda, that in fact they should be back on there. And then whole new areas such as how do we bring in the lived experience of the people that we work with. We find we're starting to do that in some areas, such as within, say, mental health, but how do we look at that across the whole board of the different types of groups we're likely to work with? I think, and probably the last thing I would say is just to say, you know, what you talk about there in our social work course for 80 years with the University of Melbourne is looking at that more broadly, is obviously the social work course is also influenced by more broadly what's happening in tertiary education. And so we would say, particularly in the last 12 months, COVID has sort of precipitated a whole lot of things, you know, that were probably slowly bubbling along and now happen very rapidly. But we now obviously see changes in how courses are funded. You know, we've had the whole big campaign in Australia around how social work students coming into courses will be funded and what fees they will be paying. We know we have a much greater international student sort of profile, although a lot of them are not able to be with us at the moment because of COVID. But, you know, interestingly enough, within our own Asia Pacific region here, we see some international students who would come to us who social work probably looks very much like what you're describing 80 years ago in Australia as far as where it's developed in their countries. And so how do we also prepare those students for very, very different contexts to what we're looking at within Australia, and also recognising the cultural importance of their own context within that. And then I think, you know, as we're saying, as we're here online today, our teaching has all been online in this last year, and this presents amazing opportunities for us to reach students that couldn't come and do face-to-face, but how do we keep that face-to-face and human element within what we do if we're very much online, but also using all of those other technologies and things that are there to develop and look around how we do. So sorts of rapid change, I guess, happening around how just tertiary education is actually provided, which will obviously flow down into social work as well. So thank you. I think that's my...
Oh, that's fabulous, David. There's so much in those issues you've flagged there for us, and I guess it really turns that lens to looking forward. You know, how do we take the opportunities now, both contextual and from what you've flagged with us, Jane, historically, to say, well, where do we head? How do we position ourselves in all that is different, but also so similar? And I think those issues that you raised around poverty in particular being perhaps off the agenda in ways it had been there is just such a reminder through this COVID crisis how important that lens on poverty is. So maybe if I can call all the panellists back on screen, and curious to hear from you with the panel discussion that we've had, and Jane inviting you into that. If we're sitting here in 80 years' time ahead, what would be the thing that you would want to see different there and really advanced? And Jane, maybe if call on you first, having listened to the discussion here.
Well, I have to say I found what Lee and Lorraine said both very interesting from very different perspectives, particularly because there isn't one Aboriginal culture in this country. There are many, and that's one of the many challenges. But I feel as if we have made. I know so much needs to be done, and social work can't do it all. A government, you know, we've got to think about some serious things like the statement from the heart, and we need to be doing a lot more at a national government level to recognise and support Aboriginal people, full stop, and to acknowledge them as the original owners of this land. So there's some huge things social work can't do, but within what social work can do, I feel as if just the questions that Lee and Lorraine raised and the things they're working with are going to mean that in 80 years' time we will be a hell of a long way further forward on the justice and the better way of life for Aboriginal people and Torres Strait Islander people in this country. I do really think that's something we've begun to see what the way is, and non-Aboriginal people have begun to understand the depth of the issues, and also to have far more respect for the very, very ancient culture of Aboriginal people, which still lives today. I think people in Miss Hislop's time had no idea of any of that. They were regarded as kind of Stone Age people who were sort of interesting for anthropologists, and that was about it. And so I don't want to, that was perhaps a bit flippant, but I really do think that in 80 years we'll see enormous improvements there, and I think that's coming both from the huge groundswell of Aboriginal people demanding their rights, but also non-Aboriginal people, including social workers, building skills and ways of working. That's my hope anyway.
Anyone else like to hazard a hope for 80 years? None of us will be held to account for this, so that's
Bury the note.
Auntie.
Yeah, look, I'd just like to add on to what Jane has said. I do see that, you know, there is a groundswell, there is a real momentum going to progress Aboriginal issues, and especially with the Uluru Statement from the Heart, people are starting to really understand what a gift that was that the Aboriginal elders gave to the rest of Australia for a way forward, and starting to recognise, yes, there is a way forward. And the establishment of the Uluru Justice Commission in Victoria just recently, the truth-telling is going to be so important. So I think that truth-telling and an acknowledgement of Australia's real history is going to set us in a really good place to move forward 80 years to a fairer society, a more just society, and where the contributions and the knowledge and the participation of Australia's First Nations people will be valued. That's where we will be in 80 years.
Excellent. Anyone else? I don't want to put you all on the spot, but please open your mic if you... Lee.
Yeah, I guess I'd just like to follow on from that, because I've only been up here a short time, but I think in that time there has been a real willingness from, you know, the government to improve the ways in which they are trying to work with Aboriginal people and communities. So I think there's definitely a willingness to, to improve things and change how things are done. And I guess from the, you know, the Aboriginal side, there is definitely a willingness to partner, and I think that just needs to be respected and reciprocated a lot more, and have some real support, you know, put in place, I think. But I do, I mean, the reason why I guess I've stayed up here and continue to be up here is because it does feel like quite a hopeful environment despite all the challenges. So yeah, I think things are on the improve, although a bit slowly.
Other thoughts? Well, we'll certainly go to a couple of questions in a moment, because I can see that there are some in the Q&A board. And I guess for me, listening to this too, you know, history is such an interesting judge of the silences of the present in many ways. And I think of some of the issues, certainly alongside those that we've talked here tonight, are really in that sort of intersectionality piece, Auntie, that you mentioned. And for me, the whole issue of gender identity is such an issue that your comment about pronouns, Jane, really strikes a chord, where women were having to assume male pronouns. But in many ways, the social work professions need to attend to the intersectionality of really diverse gender identities, and where we're positioning ourselves in that space is another issue that I imagine in 80 years we'll be having a very different conversation. So it is so provocative to think, what are our silences as much as our discourses at the moment, and what we might be looking at in even 10 years' time as just being understood so differently from the here and now. So I'm going to, if we're just wrapping that up there, we'll move across to the Q&A board. And Janet, I'm wondering if you can flag for us there some questions, having monitored that, if you'd like to come on as President of our Alumni Association and to flag the questions that have stood out for you.
Yep, I can. They're very broad, can I say?
Yes.
I think first I should just read you this one, all you participants, from Merja Satka. How wonderful to be a participant of the 80th anniversary lecture and panel. Thank you, Jane Miller and colleagues at Melbourne. I'm impressed how you're progressing, dealing with various minority issues in your education. Lots to learn to a country like Finland, having a Sami population whose issues are not yet recognised as they should be. So there we go. That's the great benefit of having an international conference participant come in. We've got an interesting question here, I think, that relates to a lot of the presentation from Kevin Myers, who asked, how does Melbourne University social work encourage and develop a lived experience workforce in, for example, mental health, AOD, justice, etc., in professional training? So who'd like to take that one?
David, would you like to respond first up?
Yeah, look, a really interesting question, and I think probably on the two levels of that, both how we bring a lived experience perspective into all of our areas, and then also particularly, I guess, which I think probably what you're getting at there, Kevin, is around, in fact, recognising that as a pathway into profession, and so. There is some various ways. A lot of that's tied up in the different sort of ways people can come into courses, but certainly we have processes, for example, with some of our courses where, for example, Indigenous students who would have background, say, working in community areas will be able to get different pathways into courses rather than having the formal qualifications, for example. You would have to say, though, that's in its early phases of development, certainly not there for all, I guess, different areas and groups that might come through that particular pathway. So I think, that's one of those areas, like I was mentioning, that's a real, I think, early days emerging area, and certainly an area to be developed further. Yep.
Thank you. Patricia Navarrete asks, I'd be interested to hear if there is now course content on adoptions and formal wards of state. I do not recall that as being part of my course in 2010. I mean, my first response to that was we do have some coverage of that material in engaging with family subject, and principally taught by Dr. Jenny Conrick, who Jane mentioned in her presentation. But I'm aware, Lou and David, there's also a specialist course in child and family welfare, is there not? I'm not sure how much coverage that particular issue gets.
Yes, there absolutely is. So there's a couple of specialist child and family subjects, and so I think it's certainly part of, not the major focus, but then also at times Jenny Conrick has taken parts of that where in fact it probably will have had a greater focus than in those parts.
Thank you. I think from Anne Fink, who's posed a few questions, but I'll just choose one. Anne asks, regarding Lee's experience, how much social anthropology is taught at Melbourne University? What relationship does the social work department have to social anthropology? For example, basic skills, or that is rather, basic skills relating to members of non-familiar cultures. So I think it feeds into that culturally sensitive practice area, doesn't it? So Lou or David?
I'm wondering if Auntie also wants to comment on that, because I think the whole experience of the subject you teach in many ways engages with that.
Well, our lectures are very, very different. They don't seem like academic lectures. They're actually yarning sessions where we get people from community to be our guest lecturers. And this year I've had a yarn with so many different organisations where we talk about self-determination, we talk about community control, we talk about identity, we talk about the lived experience. So the connection really isn't there with anthropology, but our students are master's students, and so many of them have come up through different disciplines. Some of them have come up through the social sciences and, have an anthropology background. Some come up through psychology, some come up through education. There's so many different backgrounds, and we expect students to engage with other areas and do their research, because our subject principally is about engagement with Aboriginal issues, with Aboriginal people, with Aboriginal communities. Maybe it is a bit of a hole in the subject. Maybe there could be some more connection with other disciplines too, so that's something to think about. But I still think the primary focus needs to be engagement with Aboriginal people and their communities and what the lived experience is like, because our students can go, they can do their extra research, they can learn they can learn about anthropology, they can learn about sociology, they can learn about psychology, and it'd be so difficult to cover every single one of those disciplines with an Aboriginal lens. So I suppose we are inviting our students to explore further, to delve deeper and to really think about what area of focus they would like to take and look at it through an Aboriginal lens.
Lou, I think that's probably a reasonable selection of the questions.
Thank you, Janet. That's brilliant. And I think you raise a really important question in the issue of the pathway that people have followed before they come to the master's education. Now that's such a change of trying to, in a sense, bring a 2-year filter onto such diverse, often undergraduate pathways. And I wondered, Emily, Joan or Lee, if you wanted to comment about your undergraduate pathway and how that fed into or didn't. We've had some people come from physics backgrounds, for example, into the MSW. I'd love to hear that connection for you of your educational pathway from undergrad to postgrad. So maybe Emily or Joan? Emily?
Yeah, sure. So my undergrad, I actually did do anthropology as well as criminology. So I do have that background. And I did want to say to that other question that I do feel like there are elements of the social work degree that are almost ethnographic, like the way we reflect on certain experiences and try to put ourselves in potential clients' shoes. We're really very much focused on, trying to, as much as possible, acknowledge our own subjectivity. And so I think that is a very much like social anthropology in that sense. And I think that was kind of one of the driving factors that brought me to social work, really, was that desire to really, that empathy that I think anthropology really develops. And then criminology, of course, also brought me to social work in a way, because that was very much focused on structural disadvantage within the criminal justice system and how that needs to change. So that also really put me on this pathway, I think.
Excellent, thank you. Well, look, I'm aware we're moving into our final minute or so of this evening's or today's discussion, depending on where you are. And how do we wrap up such a conversation? It's just been a brilliant time together. Jane, first and foremost, provoked by you and the ideas that you've just so beautifully thematically drawn out for us around our foundations as a Department of Social Work, but also as a social work profession in Australia. And I think from some of the questions and comments there, we can see that that's resonating internationally for people in their ways of thinking and doing social work too. So thank you enormously for that. To our panellists, for the depth and breadth of your experience that you've brought to this conversation. It's just been fabulous to hear that distillation in response to Jane's provocation tonight, to hear about how that's travelling with you in whatever stage of career and space that you're bringing your social work knowledge. So thank you for sharing your ideas and thoughts with all of that. And to those who've asked questions here tonight too, it's been fabulous to have those coming through. So thank you, Janet, for both tonight managing the questions side of things, but behind the scenes being the key protagonist for this event happening so successfully, and to colleague Ralph Hampson, who's also made sure that tonight's filming and production and movements all got us to this point of discussion. And particular thanks, Ralph, to your son Jack for helping with the filming there of Jane's talk. So all of that has made tonight possible, as has the work of Erin Halliday behind the scenes in our faculty advancement team, for ensuring you as the participants in the audience of today have been able to join us, and also to T for making sure it all flowed through beautifully tonight in this webinar space. So to everyone who's made tonight possible, thank you. As I mentioned, this is part of our ongoing 80th anniversary celebration. So the slide on the screen at the moment just highlights that we have 2 more key events for the year ahead. So there'll be more detail forthcoming, but if you would like to bookmark the late afternoon, evening of September the 22nd for our annual Lentini lecture, that will be happening with an 80th anniversary focus. And likewise, November the 25th for a morning tea, we'll be having the launch of the Alumni Pioneers project. And this has been one of the innovative student placements that's happened in the COVID context, but a long-standing desire to really capture alumni experiences into a history project. And much of that has been inspired by, Jane, your relentless pursuit of social work history. So we thank you for being the impetus behind all of that. So thank you to everyone who's joined us today and will be listening at other times to this event. We hope it's stimulated a lot of thinking, reflection and forward thinking for you in wherever endeavour of social work you're involved, whether that's practice, teaching, research and all of the above. It's a good celebration of 80 years social work at the University of Melbourne. So stay safe and well, and we'll see you in other contexts.